Hi, my name is William Thayer. I'm talking about the very serious subject of the Eurozone crisis. This video is focused on how the Europeans got themselves in such a mess, and that's called the financial death spiral. This is the second of 5 videos on the Euro crisis. The death spiral really has 3 factors. The first factor is you have a nation that has a gross domestic product, but it also has a national debt that is equal or greater than the size of its GDP. The second factor is the budget deficit is 10% of the GDP or some similar number. And the third factor is that as the national debt gets bigger, the interest rate that they have to pay on this national debt gets larger. That just means that they're getting into the death hole quicker. The fourth factor is something that's important to the Eurozone because they're bailing out the pigs. And that is they've got to worry about rollover plus budget deficits in their planning. Now, let me illustrate this with some numbers. And remember, I'm a mathematician, I love numbers. Let's say country pig starts out with, the hypothetical country pig starts out with a GDP of 100 billion, okay? Its national debt is also 100% of the GDP, so it starts out at 100, but its budget deficit is 10 at the end of the year. It's now got a national debt of 110%. That's where the US is going to be at the end of this year, 2012. So this is happening to a lot of countries, and it's not good. The second year, you start out at 110% GDP. Again, you've got a budget deficit of 10%. You end up at 120% GDP. And if you just follow this forward 6 years, you will get to 160% GDP. That is commonly known as the death zone. No country can survive a national debt that's 160% of GDP. Greece is proving that right now. They're at 160% and they're defaulting. Greece had and has a GDP of about $300 billion. 130% of that GDP, that's $390 billion. And 160%, which is the death zone, is $480 billion. Let's see what happened to Greece. In 2010, prior to 2010, the Greece had hidden the amount of debt that they really had. But when it became known in 2010, they asked for a bailout, and they revealed the fact that their debt was 130% GDP. This is pretty dangerous to start with. They also had a budget deficit of at least 10%. So at the end of the year, that was 420. And if we just go forward 2 years, you find out where you are in 2012. They're at $480 billion in debt. That's 160% of GDP. They're in the death zone. There is no way they're getting out of this without a default. They are, in fact, at this time, defaulting. Now, there's another factor that's important to realize with the financial death spiral, and that's interest rates. As the debt gets larger, the interest rates rise. Let's take a look at this with several different European countries. France has got a GDP that's 87%, or not a GDP, a national debt that's 87% of its GDP. Therefore, it's got a low interest rate, about 3%, okay? Portugal is in worse shape, 110% GDP for its national debt, and it's paying 10% or more. Okay, I think the rates are higher today. In Italy, which is 125% of national debt of 125% GDP, is paying 7%. Now, Italy's is a little bit less than Portugal. That's because Italy's got a little more credibility as a country, but nevertheless, this is way higher than what France is paying. In Greece, of course, is a basket case. They're at 160% GDP. Modestly, I would say that their interest rate is 30%, but I've seen it quoted as high as 70%. So they're obviously not viable. What does this mean? Okay, these are all mathematical terms. Okay, I'm talking about national debt, I'm talking about budget deficits, I'm talking about interest rates. Well, bear with me a little bit more. Greece in 2010 had a national debt of approximately 400 billion. They were paying 3% at that time because nobody realized how big their debt was. That was about 12 billion a year. Okay, remember their GDP is 300 billion. Half of that's 150 billion. That's their budget for their country, okay, to pay everything. 12 billion, well, that fits in that budget. But today, 2012, if they had to go to the market and refinance their entire national debt of 500 billion, they'd be paying 150 billion a year just for interest. So you've got a national budget of 150 billion, and you've got another 150 billion on top of that. Greece is not viable. It's going to have to default. Okay, let's look at the European Eurozone problem in bailing out Greece. First of all, they've got to worry about bond rollover. What bond rollover is the national debt generally has a bond maturity date of about 10 years. So that every year, a tenth of that comes due, and either you have to pay it or you have to issue another bond and basically refinance it. So you take the national debt, 500 billion in case of Greece, divide it by 10 years, you get about 50 billion. They also, of course, have got their $30 billion a year deficit. What do they need? They need 80 billion a year. Well, 80 billion a year is unsustainable for the Eurozone. The Eurozone is growing about 1% a year in good years, and that's about 100 billion a year. So basically, just Greece alone, just the Greece bailout alone, is making the Eurozone have economic stagnation forever in the future. Okay? This is not viable. But it gets worse. Let's talk about Italy. In Italy, their debt is 2.5 trillion, or as I've shown here, 2,500 billion. Divide that by 10, they need 250 billion a year for bond refinancing. They've got a budget deficit of not 10% like Greece, but 5%. That's bad enough because that's 100 billion a year. So what do they need? They need 350 billion a year. Let's put this all together. I call this the pigs' yearly cash flow, and here I'm talking about Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain. That's the pigs. They need 500 billion a year for rollover. They need about 160 billion for deficits. They need 660 billion a year. And where are they getting this from? Remember, Italy and Spain are the recipients here. The only two countries that are contributing here are France and Germany. Now, they've got a combined GDP, those two countries, of 6 trillion. How are you going to get 660 billion out of 6 trillion? You're not. Thank you very much for your attention. The next tape is on derivatives, one of the financial flaws that's going to make the Euro crisis situation much worse.